Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. Today we are discussing Team Ninja's Nioh, a challenging action game set in turn of the 16th century Japan. The game features plenty of samurai, including some famous names from the period, but adds an interesting twist, including the supernatural at the core of its narrative and its game mechanics. The Japanese supernatural, to be more specific. The game features creatures from what it calls the yokai realm, from giant beasts to human or vaguely human figures. Team Ninja are borrowing heavily here from an existing deep vault of tales and characters in Japanese folklore. I'm joined today by Michael Dillon Foster, Professor of Japanese at the University of California, Davis, and I'm looking forward to asking him about these representations in the game. Michael is co-editor of The Folkloresque, Reframing Folklore in a Popular Culture World, available from Utah State University Press. And he's also author of The Book of Yokai from the University of California Press, among other publications. His research focuses on folklore, literature, and popular culture, primarily in Japan. He's interested in how cultural phenomena and beliefs, particularly those associated with the supernatural, are articulated through textual and visual media, as well as performance, ritual, and everyday contexts. So we thought he'd be a great guest. Michael, we're very happy to have you. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, John. I'm really happy to be on the show.
No, it's great. I was hoping we could start, if it's okay, Michael, just to take a moment. We'll get on to the representations in the game in short order, but just to give you a chance to share with us, what are yokai? How would you introduce this concept to us? What is a yokai? What is the concept?
Okay, yokai is a really difficult word to translate into accurate English. It's often translated as monsters or spirits or goblins or something like that. But if you sort of trace back into the history of the Japanese supernatural and these sort of mysterious creatures, they're not only creatures, physical, embodied animals or human-shaped beings, but they're also phenomena. A strange sound in the woods would be attributed to something odd, something supernatural, something mysterious. And all those words, all those phenomena, all those creatures, all those things, all those beings come together in a sort of catch-all word, yokai. The word itself, I should mention, is actually relatively recent in common usage. It's been around actually for hundreds of years as a sort of a Japanese adaptation of a Chinese set of characters. But as far as being a common term, it's only really come into being about 120 years ago, and even more so as the kind of catch-all term for these things in the last, I'd say, 20, 30 years. What's embodied in that are all sorts of things. Most commonly, they're sort of shape-shifting animals. Famously, the Japanese kitsune or fox is a shape-shifting animal that might turn into a beautiful woman and seduce a man and kill him. A tanuki, which is a raccoon dog, a real animal, also turns into all sorts of human-like creatures or other kinds of phenomena. Those are very common, but there's also yokai such as the kappa, which is a water creature. And there's legends of kappa found throughout Japan. It's a water creature that lives in rivers or pools and yanks people and animals into the water. So those are sort of different forms of physical yokai creatures, sort of animals, either real or imaginary, that are found in local legends and folk tales throughout Japan.
That's interesting, Michael, because the way you're talking about yokai, and this is where you should step in and correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, it almost seems not that they're mundane or anything like that, but almost that in this kind of in-betweenness, they're certainly in a kind of a... The word medieval isn't great in Japanese historiography anyway, but like in a kind of and pre-modern isn't actually much better, but it is kind of in this certain kind of time when the tales are extremely popular, that it's almost like a kind of a regular feature of life or something, as opposed to the game has this very kind of gonzo storyline involving magic stones that protect the Japanese from foreign invasion and everything else, and there's this evil wizard and everything else, but you end up in these big face-offs, lots of which can be determined by the game, because the game, this particular genre is designed around fighting bosses, very large, difficult kind of confrontations. And so you kind of at least I'm a married man with a very demanding job, so I've only gotten so far in the game. But you kind of meet a feminine style kind of figure who clearly looks to take energy from you. There's a giant caterpillar. There's a kind of a Japanese version of this, kind of a different animals jumbled into one kind of form.
Right.
I mean, the game is doing what it's doing. I guess what I'm asking is, am I wrong to kind of assume almost that one of the things the game is doing is massively exaggerating the sense to which they would have been strange in that sense or dramatic?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. I think that what the game seems to be doing is taking these creatures, these manifestations that were really very localized. They're sort of told in local village legends, sometimes in cities, whatever. But they weren't these kind of monumentally massive creatures, these large demonic boss-like figures that held the key to an entire realm. They were much more local and sort of, I don't want to say casual, but they weren't quite, and they were often quite deadly. I mean, this is not to play down some of their negative powers, although a lot of them were ambiguous, but they weren't necessarily something that, sort of the evil boss kind of figure that they seem to appear in the game. I think the game has maybe one sort of facile interpretation of what it's done. It's taking these as characters and monumentalized them in a kind of much more contemporary Hollywood / video game big format to make battles more meaningful in a sense, rather than just getting rid of a minor little troublesome creature. If that makes sense. Having said that, I mean, I'm thinking back. There's for example, a very famous yokai-related story, a story called Shuten Doji, which has a demon-like figure, an oni, an ogre type creature that attacks the capital, attacks the Heian capital, or what's now called Kyoto, and abducts young women and eats them. So he really is a very demonic figure, and several great heroes from Japanese history go after him in his mountain lair and eventually cut off his head, and that became a wonderful set of picture scrolls and very graphic sort of visual representations for the period. So there was that aspect existed as well. But for the most part, when we think of yokai, they're on a much smaller scale, I think.
Right.
Much less sort of consequential and monumental,
right,
and personal, maybe.
It's funny, you brought it up as well in terms of it's, if not quite ironic, certainly fascinating that this term, that the term yokai is coined by this debunker / super fan, I suppose, of the idea.
Right.
But you also were talking about almost like a Hollywood kind of stylized thing. And in fact, if you play through the game, you do kind of encounter here and there these kind of very smaller yokai figures whose bone structure seems to allow them to kind of flop around a little bit more. Okay. And they're clearly aggressive and clearly out to get you kind of thing. And they're, I've seen this kind of an iteration in various East Asian media before, but they're kind of zombie fodder a little bit. And so it's something that interests me about Nioh. In talking about it, it seems to me to tell us as much about how the Japanese developers of the game are interpreting and recalibrating their present-day culture. It's certain. I mean, they're not trying to present an accurate picture of medieval folklore anyway, or of Japanese folklore. But I just that intrigues me, that the choices that they've made, like the chimera type figure of the Nioh, becomes this large, terrifying thunder beast. Right. For example, and is just a great enemy in a video game, and that's a good enough reason to do it,
Right, and I think that's what I find really fascinating about video games and anime and other sort of popular culture manifestations and expressions of folklore, is that there's no reason they have to stay faithful to what was collected as an orally conveyed legend 120 years ago. There's no necessity to do that. And in fact, if we go back and really look at, and this is my own theory of one reason yokai are still very much a presence in Japanese cultural life, in things like anime and video games, is because ever since the Edo period, from around 1600 to 1868, the period actually right after the setting of the game, really. Yokai were used in various different sorts of media. So local yokai from legend would be reproduced in an ukiyo-e woodblock print. There were all sorts of. This was the time in which relatively cheap print media became popular. The sort of precursor to what we now call manga really started in the late 1700s. I think there was a form of called kibyoshi, which was very popular, often comical, often full of puns, often lighthearted, illustrated books, short books. And in those books, all sorts of yokai from local communities were exhibited and made into characters. And so, whether they were faithful to the original or the earlier version, the folkloric version, is irrelevant. They became popular in what they were at that time, and very popular among the readers. And then they morphed into other creatures from there, and they took on different personalities. So that, for example, there was again, this is a little geeky, but there was something called a Mikoshi Nyudo, which was a yokai that was reported in various local communities. You'd meet him in the woods, and it looked like a monk-type figure, a bald-headed human figure, and he would grow very long. His neck and his body would extend, and there were various ways of getting past him. That figure, for whatever reason, morphed during the Edo period in these popular culture media into a kind of king of yokai, a leader of yokai. And he was paired up with a Dokudo Kubi, which is a long-necked woman who was also from older folklore, but she became a kind of popular culture figure.
Right.
All this to say that I think that what they're doing in Nioh is what has often and always been done with folklore and popular culture. The two are really intertwined. And it's really reflecting perhaps a more Hollywood sensibility, a more contemporary accessibility and sensibility now. It's not to say it's corrupting anything. It's just changing it in a very creative way.
Yeah, and I bring it up because I'm so interested in what you also mentioned, this, the notion of the authorship of the product versus the reception of the product, right? And the notion that, Japanese creators will play with things either with a very intentional, with a very clear ambition to do certain things, or just with a kind of almost like a freedom, a comfort level that then is received also by their audience. And I guess it must be 15 years gone now when there was the big wave of Japanese horror movies that began to become popular in the US, in the Western world, and then later some were adapted, the Ringu movies famously and everything else. And so I think Westerners had this idea of, the long dark-haired prepubescent girl getting out of a swimming pool, or water again showing up, right? And so I just really am fascinated by how Nioh does similar things and creates similar disparities, and I'm just fascinated by I guess maybe you could do it better than I can. I'm fascinated by just the comfort, I suppose. You're in your own culture, you're playing with these ideas, you're changing things, and I think that this is kind of when part of video games becoming more quote-unquote legitimate as just being around longer, as it were. But I think to see that kind of creativity is... I just think it's an interesting... It's interesting for me to think about Nioh.
Yeah, I think... one way to think of it, I've tried to think of how video games and other popular culture media will use folklore to create something new. And one way to think of it, I don't think it's the only way to think of it, but you mentioned, for example, that the Ringu movies and this long haired woman coming out of a well, and they're doing exactly what they're doing to a certain extent is taking motifs from folklore and earlier stories and earlier literature, earlier films even. They're taking motifs and cobbling them together in a slightly different way. So for example, there is older folklore about a woman thrown into a well in Japan. There's a very famous Edo period legend, and the idea of hair, straggly long hair is something that comes up in all sorts of motifs in Japan, in kabuki plays and folklore and all sorts of literature. And again, the notion of the well we mentioned earlier, the liminality of it. The well itself is a portal between the world of the land and the world of underground water and whatnot. So there's all these different motifs that are being cobbled together into a very into a new character. And that, I think, it's that use of older imagery that has a resonance for the viewers, put into a new package that makes it particularly resonant as a new product, but with a sense of something they can hold on to because they've seen it before. And I think that the same sort of thing must be happening in Nioh as well. I mean, each of those characters, each of the yokai characters that I've seen just in some of the footage, has something that looks familiar to people who know about yokai. Not everything, not 100%. It's not something you would see in an 18th century book, but some aspect of it is familiar. You mentioned, for example, the giant centipede, and indeed, the moment I saw that, it reminded me of the mukade, which is a real, actually deadly little centipede that's found in, or millipede, I'm not sure which, but that's found in Japan. But is also in a giant form, comes out in several very famous legends, particularly around the Kyoto, the Otsu area. And so they obviously have, so it was familiar to me in that way, and then it was exciting to see how they had revitalized it and given it added energy and character in that particular video game form.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mike. We really appreciated having you.
Oh, thank you, John. I've really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. And thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed watching it as much as we enjoyed making the episode and having this discussion. Please consider giving us a like beneath the video and subscribing to the channel if you do not already. There is a website, historyrespawned.com, that combines our videos as well as our podcast, which can also be found through iTunes, Google Play, and Soundcloud. Finally, if you want to support us and help us make more of these videos, you can help with a monthly donation of your choice at patreon.com/historyrespawned. Thanks, and we hope to see you again next time.